I think most of you know who I am, but for those of you who don't, my name is Mary Ann Benninger. I'm president of St. Ben's. On behalf of the entire College of Saint Benedict and St. John's University community, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2013 Renaissance Lecture. I want to extend a very special welcome to our guest of honor this evening. Colette Peters is a College of Saint Benedict graduate from the class of 1993. We're thrilled, Colette, to welcome you back to St. Ben's, and I look forward to hearing about your experiences as the first woman to lead the Oregon Department of Corrections, and it sounds like some more reflections on all kinds of other things related to that. Well, we established the Renaissance series in 2006 to bring speakers to College of Saint Benedict who demonstrate the diversity of opportunities available for women and men, and to encourage students to broaden their horizons in every respect, particularly in areas that are less traditional for the respective genders. This is the 8th Renaissance event. Past speakers have been a conservation activist, a space explorer, a photographer, a director for the U.S. Department of State, a professor, an economist, and a political analyst. And we're very excited to welcome our own alum, Colette, here today. At this time, I'd like to invite CSB student Liz Beatty forward to introduce this evening's speaker. Liz is a CSB senior majoring in biology with a psychology minor and a Hispanic studies concentration, pre-med, and physical therapy. I don't know how she does it all. She does many other things too. She currently serves as the student director for the Institute for Women's Leadership at St. Ben's. She's also involved with the Benedictine Friends and the Student Ambassador Program, and she volunteers in the St. Cloud Hospital Emergency Room with the Student Health Assistant Program. After college, she plans to attend medical school, and I think that's more than a plan. I'm feeling quite certain that that's going to happen. So please join me in welcoming Liz Beatty.
Thank you, President Benninger. Colette S. Peters is the first woman to lead the Oregon Department of Corrections. She oversees Oregon's 14 correctional facilities with an inmate population of 14,000 and manages 4,300 employees with a 2-year budget of $1.4 billion. She was appointed to the position by Governor John Kitzhaber, and her appointment was confirmed by the Oregon Senate on February 13, 2012. Ms. Peters is a native of Milbank, South Dakota, a small farming town near the Minnesota-South Dakota border. She earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from the College of Saint Benedict in 1993. Following her graduation from CSB, she served as a juvenile counselor in Iowa, worked in a halfway house for gang members in Minneapolis, and served as a victims advocate with the Denver Police Department. Ms. Peters also earned a criminal justice master's degree from the University of Colorado. In 2004, she became the Oregon Corrections Department's Public Affairs Administrator and was soon promoted to Assistant Director. Ms. Peters was given a second title as Inspector General, serving as an advisor to Max Williams, who then ran the Corrections Department. She left the department in 2008 when her family moved back to Minnesota. But in 2009, Peters and her family returned to Oregon when she was selected to head the Oregon Youth Authority. She held that post until Governor Kitzhaber appointed her to run the Department of Corrections. Ms. Peters will speak tonight at College of Saint Benedict about her experiences as the first woman to lead the Oregon Department of Corrections. Please join me in welcoming Colette Peters.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, President Benninger and Ms. Beatty, for that really kind introduction. It really is a pleasure to be back, and I want to thank the College of Saint Benedict for welcoming me to the President's Renaissance Lecture Series. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time, and as a graduate of St. Ben's, I have to tell you I feel so privileged to be here to share insights about my education, career, and the work I'm really honored to be engaged in at the Oregon Department of Corrections. As was alluded to a minute ago, I'm a Midwesterner, and I'm a Midwesterner at heart, having grown up approximately 3 hours west of here in the small town of Milbank, South Dakota. It is so great to be back in the upper Midwest, although it is incredibly cold, and Madam President, I am not used to it. I was blessed to have been one of 7 children, and to this day, we are still the closest of friends. We were raised by 2 thoughtful, caring, incredibly hard-working parents who, although they self-proclaimed not to ever have 2 nickels to rub together, they instilled in us, yet not overtly, to understand the importance of investing in a Catholic liberal arts education. Amongst us, there are 6 sisters and 1 brother, and don't feel bad for him for 1 minute. He survived just fine. That's often the reaction I get. They empowered all 7 of us to believe that we could do and be whatever we wanted to be. Gender would not play a role. Some of my siblings, including St. Ben's graduate Rebecca Peters and my dear mother, Patricia Peters, are here today, as are some of our in-laws. I was wondering if you would either stand or wave to be recognized. I thank you so much for being here today. I had the privilege of really further developing myself here on this beautiful campus. I had the honor of working with so many thoughtful, enthusiastic professors, and just to name a few, Dr. Michael Livingston, Dr. Tom Creed, Dr. Martin Andrews, Sister Dennis, Sister Anne Marie. Some of them are still here today impacting all of you, and one is no longer with us. I also had the privilege of studying alongside Matt Lindstrom, who is now a political science professor here. I also experienced the lens-widening adventure of studying abroad on a Greco-Roman trip with Steve Wagner and Karen Johnston. The impressions they and that trip placed on me are still with me today, as are the impressions my dear friends from St. Ben's and St. John's placed on me, many of whom I still maintain contact with and rely on them to help guide me through life. I also fell in love here. As the beautiful cliche goes, I married a Johnny, Lynn Snyder, class of 1992, and we have now spent almost 21 years together, incredible years, nearly 18 of them in marriage. We are both so grateful for the foundational start St. Ben's and St. John's provided for us. And now that you've calculated my age, let's quickly step along. As President Benninger mentioned, during the last 20 years, I have been involved in many parts of the public safety continuum, from juvenile to adult corrections. I have worked as a frontline staff member in juvenile corrections facilities and in a primary school. I've worked as a crisis mediator, victim advocate, research associate, and the inspector general. Most recently, as was just mentioned, prior to returning to the Department of Corrections, I was the director of the Oregon Youth Authority. Now, that is the state agency responsible for the care and custody of all juvenile offenders ages 12 through 24 in correctional facilities and on probation and parole in the community throughout the state of Oregon. This array of experience in the criminal justice system has really helped me form my beliefs in the role of public safety. I believe that an effective justice system holds offenders accountable for their actions, provides those swift and certain sanctions for those actions, invests in rehabilitation in order to improve that likelihood that those individuals are going to succeed upon relief. It needs to be a system that really provides reentry supports to reduce those barriers to leading a crime-free life. And swirling all these together, it has to be a system that actually prevents future victimization. And as a former victims advocate, that last piece is so important to me. When I worked for the Denver Police Department, In that capacity, I supervised a team of crisis mediators. Now, we responded on scene to all crimes against persons. So we went to all homicides, sex assaults, suicides, cases of domestic violence, and we conducted all the death notifications in the city. So I have seen firsthand the death and destruction that offenders can have on victims. And I think about that each day in the work that I'm doing. We wouldn't have a public safety system if we didn't have victims or survivors of crime, right? And yet, unfortunately, that voice is often not at the table when we're talking about how we're going to spend resources and how we're going to prioritize programs. So I come to the table with that background, and I'm really not able to work with an offender without seeing the shadow of their victim or victims behind them. Now, in this capacity, unfortunately, I can't prevent the victim that was created from the crime that sent someone to prison. But I believe that preventing future victimization is really what our mission is all about. I also believe, and my professors will be proud, that relying on research and data is so important to really help us drive those policy decisions. We know so much more about what works in corrections and public safety than we did when I was here more than 20 years ago. Especially in these times of scarce resources, it is ever more important for us to focus on research-based programs and services that really ensure that taxpayer dollars are spent wisely and effectively. And that's something I'm really committed to make sure that the investments that we're making in Oregon will ensure a safe environment for our staff and achieve the greatest positive impact on our adults in custody and those we're supervising in the community. I'd like to start this evening by sharing some of my observations of public safety, given my experience over the last 20 years. I'll then talk about the Oregon Department of Corrections so we have a common understanding of the agency and my current role. And from there, I'll talk specifically about women in corrections and the workplace generally, the importance of education, and then share some of my thoughts on leadership. Every day, you, like every American, drive past police stations, jails, community corrections offices, and prisons. Yet people are still startled to learn the facts about incarceration. Today, a snapshot reveals there are about 1 in 34 adults in prison or jail, or on probation and parole in the United States. That means just behind bars, there are 2.2 million people incarcerated in the United States. And it's important to understand that is a rate of incarceration far higher than that of any other industrialized nation. But that is just a snapshot in time. As of 2010, there were 19.8 million people with felony records in the United States. That represents about 8.6% of the adult population. So think about that. If we were a fair representation of our population, I'll pick on my family, we could do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 felony record. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 felony record. And we could go around the room. Now, we are not a fair representation of the population for so many reasons. Race, economic means, and if I'm scanning the room accurately, I think there are probably more women in the audience than men. That's not the way it is in prison. As you might suspect, we incarcerate substantially fewer women in prison than men. In Oregon, it's about 1,200 women versus the overall 14,200. And this is fairly consistent with national trends. Yet we're trending in the wrong direction. The number of women in prison is increasing at nearly double the rate of men. 1/3 of the women are incarcerated for drug offenses or property crimes that really occurred to support their drug addictions. 2/3 of women in state prisons are mothers of minor children. I'd like you to remember that important statistic because I'm going to delve into it deeper this evening. On this national holiday to honor the dreams of Martin Luther King Jr., while we have achieved so much Unfortunately, our nation has a disproportionate number of minorities in our system at every point of our criminal justice continuum. More than 60% of incarcerated adults are racial and ethnic minorities, with African Americans having the highest disproportionate representation. In fact, according to the Sentencing Project, 1 of every 3 African American males born today can expect to go to prison if current trends continue. Many of the individuals, not just the women, who are incarcerated are in need of substance abuse treatment, mental health treatment, and even just basic education. These trends have resulted in prison overcrowding and state governments just spending more and more on corrections while other really critical public safety areas go underfunded. Nationally, this year alone, 700,000 people will return to their communities after being in prison. These individuals across the country face a lifetime of barriers to housing, education, and employment. Pretty staggering statistics, but now I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about why this should be of concern to you. Remember, I said that an effective public safety system holds offenders accountable, invests in rehabilitation, and provides reentry supports to prevent future victimization. In Oregon, on average, we release approximately 300 individuals every month, or about 4,500 each year, which is a part of that 700,000 nationally that I spoke to. These are individuals who have victimized before, and we are charged with ensuring they don't victimize again. In fact, of the individuals who are sent to prison, most are coming back to our communities, 93% of them, in fact. Over 50% of the offenders in our custody need mental health treatment. 73% of the offenders in our custody need substance abuse treatment. And folks, incarceration is expensive. It is expensive in Minnesota, in Oregon, and across the country. In Oregon, we spend almost $85 a day to incarcerate 1 adult in an Oregon prison. We spend $1.4 billion every biennium just on adult corrections. And as a quick comparison in spending, in Oregon, we spend $10,000 a year to educate a K-12 student versus $30,000 to keep an adult offender in prison. Imagine if we reversed those spending trends. Now, if these offenders do commit a new felony crime that lands them back in prison, we spend another $100,000 incarcerating them for that next crime. Building a new prison is expensive, $200 to $400 million to construct a new prison, and that doesn't include the ongoing operational costs. Now, on a positive note, Oregon has been touted as having the lowest recidivism rate in the country at 26.5%. But with that, I believe we still have an obligation to do better, because with all those other previous stats we just mentioned, if we can further reduce the recidivism rate by just 1%, we can prevent victimization and save $4.3 million in annual victim and taxpayer costs. So, how do we do that? We know from research and experience that the most effective way to reduce future criminal behavior is to provide adults in custody with the right combination of treatment, education, and job preparation. To determine that correct combination of programming, we conduct an assessment at intake of each individual's risk factors and needs, and then we customize a corrections plan. And I really see it as a roadmap from the time someone enters our doors until the day they release. Our philosophy in Oregon is that transition back to the community begins on day 1 in prison, regardless if someone is going to spend 2 years with us or 25. These individuals likely have needed intervention for years, and now we have them, if you will, as a captive audience. We try to take full advantage of that. I think it's important to note that we as a society, send people to prison as punishment, not for punishment. That separation from society by being in prison taking away all their liberties is the punishment. We do that by holding offenders accountable for their actions, which is, in my opinion, simply more than carrying out the court's orders for that prescribed length of time. Holding adults in custody accountable means helping them acknowledge and take responsibility for their behaviors and actions, and to make those commitments for positive change. For those individuals in this room, or for those that you know have the belief that we should lock them up, throw away the key, and give them bread and water. And trust me, in this role, I hear that from people often. There is nothing good, and there is no deterrent effect from the inhumane treatment of offenders. In fact, it creates the opposite effect of what we would want. If you treat people who are antisocially, you make them, no surprise, more antisocial. And if we want to change outcomes, then it's going to take more than just the prison system to adopt a different way of talking about and dealing with criminal behavior. We, the broader society, has to change our thinking of these offenders as well. And I challenge you to start thinking about that tonight. We have to decide that if we truly want them to succeed, and that once they have served their sentence, we are done punishing them. And this really dovetails into the second half of our mission at the Oregon Department of Corrections, which is to reduce the likelihood that individuals will commit another crime after release. As a former victim advocate, what this means for me is that another victim is not created when offenders return to their community. But as the director of the department, it means even more than that. It means that individuals return home, find jobs, pay taxes, engage actively in their children and their families, and become a part of healthy, vibrant communities. Well, this is no small task. In addition, we have our team who is responsible to help us achieve that. While we have approximately 14,000 incarcerated felons in 14 prisons across the state, as was mentioned earlier, we have another 31,000 felons in the community who are being supervised either on probation or on parole. And we are fortunate to have that team of 4,300 individuals who are dedicated professionals that carry out their mission every day. Now, when you shut your eyes and you think about what those individuals might look like or what environment they're in, let me tell you, what you see on television and in the movies about prison life is very different than what you will see inside Oregon's correctional facilities. Staff really hold themselves to a very high standard. Each team member understands that he or she has the responsibility to protect the public, keep the prison safe, and to prepare the adults in our custody to become those successful, productive, tax-paying members of society once they release. So what you would likely see if you walked into one of our 14 institutions would be orderly and calm operations. You would see Department of Corrections professionals engaging in respectful interactions with those in our custody. My officers don't carry weapons. Their biggest defense is the relationship they're creating with that offender inside those prison walls. And this is so important because people learn by watching the behaviors of others, right? Every interaction between a staff member and an offender is an opportunity for us to really role model pro-social behavior. And reinforcement of positive behaviors, as we all know, goes a long way with anyone. You would see our staff redirecting offenders in instances where they haven't learned how to act appropriately or pro-socially. And part of what we do is really try to find those teachable moments because we believe that we have every opportunity to help someone make change. Every day, staff really encourage those offenders who come to us pretty rugged with rough histories and convince them that making better choices is not backing down, but it really is a sign of strength. It is a pleasure to be before a group of individuals who I know understand how important education is. I can't emphasize enough how important education is for all Americans, but it especially plays an important major factor in an adult successful reentry. Research shows us that individuals who participate in correctional education programs have lower rates of recidivism, rearrest, and reconviction. And the higher the individual's education goes, the greater the fall in the likelihood that person will recidivate. When I was the director of the Oregon Youth Authority, I met a young man when I was touring one of the youth correctional facilities on the Oregon coast. This young man shared with me that he had started on a path of education while inside the juvenile justice system, and he quickly became hooked on education, not knowing before that he could ever be successful in this arena. After he obtained his high school diploma, he worked jobs while in custody, earned and paid for his associate's degree and his bachelor's degree. Toward the end of my tenure at the Oregon Youth Authority, I was asked to be a guest lecturer for a criminal justice class at Portland State University. That day, I met this young man for the second time. He was sitting in the audience as a university student and working toward his master's degree. Now, he had obviously shared his past with the class, because when I got to the point of my presentation where I shared the likelihood of his success because of his academic achievements, the class roared with applause. And here are those statistics. As I said, our current recidivism rate is about 26.5%. With an associate's degree, that falls to 14%. With a bachelor's degree, that falls down to 6%. And as in the case with his master's degree, that number falls to 0. So again, we must invest in or make available correctional approaches that work. And I want to be really clear, this is not a get soft on crime approach. Instead, it's as much about holding offenders accountable to a higher degree as it is really providing ways for them to change their criminal thinking and lead pro-social lives when returning to the community. It is about preventing future victimization. I'd like to add an important piece to this, which is programming, education, and treatment for these adults in custody goes far beyond that individual in front of us. It has great impacts on the family. It can have great impacts on generations of family members, because we know that without intervention, without treatment, without education and other supports, the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that led to criminal behavior will continue to pass from parent to child and on to the next generations. If we are going to improve the lives of children and keep them safe and healthy, if we're going to reduce poverty, really talk seriously about stopping crime and making communities safer, we must find effective ways of intervening in and breaking that intergenerational cycle of criminality. To do that, we must look to the needs of the children of incarcerated parents. Throughout my career, I have encountered many incarcerated moms and dads who have not grown up in healthy families and who don't have the skills to parent. Activities as basic as playing with their children or reading to their children have never been modeled for them. They have no strong, supportive community connections to help them learn and practice those good parenting skills. They don't even realize where they're lacking, nor do they know how to find or access resources that could help them. During my previous tenure at the Department of Corrections, I was pregnant not once, but twice. And I now have 3 beautiful girls. And for those of you that are struggling with the math, I'm happy to note the second pregnancy resulted in a beautiful set of identical twin girls. I remember during that pregnancy meeting with a group of incarcerated women at our women's facility who were engaged in one of the great programs the Department of Corrections has to offer. It was the Even Start program, which literally and physically connects incarcerated mothers with their young children and focuses on family literacy. I was learning about the program, and the women were explaining to me, and it seemed that since I was pregnant, they were talking to me more as a mom than as the Inspector General. But they were explaining to me the complexities of their lives and the things they didn't know prior to these parenting classes. One woman was explaining to me the series of crimes that led to her incarceration. One of the aggravating factors was having a crack pipe in her diaper bag. Now, she proudly told me that she knew enough that she shouldn't use drugs around her baby, but she didn't realize that placing drugs next to those diapers and next to that formula in the diaper bag could be harmful for her child. In that moment, pregnant out to here, I remember thinking the worst thing I had done during this pregnancy was to have gone to bed one night forgetting to have taken my prenatal vitamin. Needless to say, we have incarcerated moms and dads who need our help. Those children need our help. And not just to improve our public safety outcomes. Incarcerated individuals and their families who receive the supports they need place fewer burdens on the state's foster care system, the juvenile justice system, and then ultimately on adult corrections. Fewer children move into dependency and delinquency. And in order to help the children of incarcerated parents, I believe we must address the needs of the parents and the family as a whole. And let's not forget, the majority of those who are incarcerated will eventually return home. They will be your neighbor. The kids will go to school with your kids. They may serve you your morning coffee or pump your gas, or hopefully, if we've really done our job right, they become your colleague one day. Please remember this as you choose your career paths and become working professionals. Please help me not let these groups of individuals become castaways or forgotten. President Benninger established this lecture series, as she mentioned earlier tonight, to demonstrate the diversity of opportunities available to women and men, particularly in areas that are less traditional of their respective gender. I will try to do my part to address this important theme tonight. From a very early age, I knew I wanted to help others. I have this one very vivid recollection. One day during my kindergarten class, a classmate brought a knife to school. I remember watching as my teacher took him, holding him under her arm like a football and marching him to the principal's office. And I remember thinking to myself, I can help him. I need to help him. I believe so deeply in human potential and that people can change. I think that was a large draw for me to a liberal arts college with a Benedictine philosophy and a psychology degree. This type of liberal arts foundation and academic focus really was my bridge to a career in criminal justice and public safety. It is because this place opened my eyes just beyond understanding psychology and statistics. It opened my mind to understanding different people and different ways of thinking, and to understand that the psychology of individuals affects society as a whole. The whole of my education, highlighted in those Benedictine principles, helped me understand that really important link between public safety and moral and social responsibility. And as I took my liberal arts education into a career with public safety, over the years, I've really come to know how intimately connected the public safety system and the social services fields are. And we're seeing this more and more every day as the pendulum is swinging in many states from correction systems that were once focused only on punishment to those that are really rooted in rehabilitation and reformation, just like the Oregon system I just described. So I feel very honored to be the first female director of the Department of Corrections in Oregon. But with that, I think comes great responsibility. Responsibility to acknowledge and respect the achievements women before me have made to advance our field. Responsibility to really role model and mentor other women who are contributing to the future in the corrections field, in the workplace generally, and in society. And responsibility really to cultivate the best team of women and men to achieve our collective goals. I have the privilege of coming to public safety after the first female corrections officer, the first female captain, the first female superintendent. When I was the inspector general, it was following already 2 women who had held that post. And I really remind myself of that privilege because I often try to imagine back to 1977, after already more than 100-year history of incarcerating individuals, primarily men, with supervised men in those prisons, being Debbie Martin, the first female correctional officer in Oregon. At just 23 years of age, Miss Martin was the first to have worked alongside the male correction officers at the Oregon State Penitentiary. At that time, she was the only woman to don that uniform and walk alongside those men. She is the one who opened the door for women in corrections in the state of Oregon. And I give credit to both my female colleagues who led the way in corrections and also to the men who embraced those first female corrections officers to walk the tier as their equal partners. Today, 34% of my employees are women. Of our managers, about 37% are women. And I am extremely proud that we have 6 women out of 13 on our executive management team. But I keep in mind every day that it wasn't long ago when women were far more underrepresented in corrections and in the workforce generally than they are today. And I remind myself every day that we must do better. I mentioned earlier how strong I really feel about education, especially as it relates to recidivism, yet I feel very strongly about education for women. And we've made strides in this area. Consider these statistics. According to the 2010 census, of those employed today, more women than men have a bachelor's degree. That 37% of women versus 35% of men. And of the younger working population, that's even a broader distinction. 36% of women have bachelor's degrees or higher compared to 28% of men. So we're continuing to improve. In addition, more women than men hold master's degrees or higher, although again by a small margin, 10.6 million women compared to nearly 10.5 million men. But nonetheless, we've moved the bar over the mark. And even though now women outnumber men in colleges, it's important to remember the fight to learn was a struggle waged by many women across many years and across many cultures. In fact, early on, women had largely been excluded from the educational system. While Harvard, the first college chartered in this country, opened in 1736, the first college to admit women didn't do so for another 200 years. And women did not begin attending college in equal numbers to men until as recently as 1980. That means while I walked on this campus feeling equal to my male classmates, that was a privilege really being afforded for one of the first times. It was 1989. Those who fought for higher education for women were faced with arguments that women lacked the capacity that men had for that intellectual development, or they would actually be harmed for striving for it, if you can imagine that. These alleged weaknesses were also used against coeducation. As an example, Harvard opened its annex, Radcliffe, for women in 1879 rather than admit women to the men's campus. This separation of colleges solely for men and those solely for women remained the norm in America until the early 1970s. While many institutions have moved away from gender-separated schools, it was the all-women's campus at St. Ben's that called me here and personally helped me strive to expect no boundaries. In fact, the research now tells us that women's colleges that remain today enroll a very diverse cross-section of the country, and research shows that women at single-sex colleges are more engaged than women at coeducational institutions, and that certainly was my experience here at St. Ben's. The feminist beliefs of which my family helped me develop, and that I further developed here at St. Ben's, helped me recognize the dynamics of what I faced with beyond the textbooks. Yet, even as co-education grew, women's courses of study were often different than men's. Historically, women have tended towards the humanities and arts rather than science, technology, engineering, or math, or STEM, as the new acronym we're all becoming familiar with. And I think this is really important, and we're seeing the advancements that are occurring right here on this campus and the change in focus to help those dynamics change as well. This year, the theme for Women's History Month, for those of you who haven't heard, is Inspiring Women Innovation Through Imagination, celebrating women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I think that focus is so important to expand and broaden our horizons for all women. And I think First Lady Michelle Obama said it so well She said that if we are going to out-innovate and out-educate the rest of the world, we've got to open doors for everyone. We need all hands on deck, and that means clearing hurdles for women and girls as they navigate careers in science, technology, engineering, and math. But no matter what field of study, we need to encourage and support our young women in all our education and career goals. Equal opportunity to learn is often taken for granted today. I took it for granted, as I assumed it was the norm when I entered this campus. I didn't realize it was a new privilege that had been afforded to me. And as I said, we owe so much of that to women who were pioneers in education many years before us. We owe it to the future generations now, though, to open even more doors and break down more barriers to advance even further. Now, while there is no doubt that women have come a long way from the discrimination we faced in the previous century when it came to work and education, there is still more work to do. So even as we're gaining strides, in 2011, women comprised 47% of the total U.S. workforce and comprised 51% of management, professional, and related positions. Yet women only make 77 cents for every dollar that men earn. But we're gaining in earnings. We've actually gained over the last 10 years, while our male counterparts' salaries have remained stagnant. We now have women in leadership at Fortune 500 companies, yet we are woefully represented at the CEO level. Of the 2012 list of Fortune 500 companies, 18 are run by women. As the CEO of a $1.4 billion organization, if you look at the other 49 individuals in these roles across the country, the other 50 if you can include the Federal Bureau of Prisons, there are just 2 other women. So I wish I could stand before you all and tell you that all the work of those before us have eliminated discrimination and that inequality is left to the history books for women and minorities. But that's not true. As we're entering 2013, we still must deal with gender imbalance, as reflected in my stats earlier. And really, push gender aside. I am sure that everyone in this room at some point in their life has been misjudged or discriminated against for the beliefs, age, country of origin, race, sexual orientation, faith, and so on. So of course, I have not been immune to that. However, I've always felt so grateful as it relates to my gender that my career developed during a more privileged time than my predecessors, and really because of their hard work, men and women alike, I've been given great opportunities. Yet our work is not done. Several years ago, as the Inspector General, I was assisting in investigating a really high-level, complicated, sensitive criminal investigation of one of our high-level administrators. We pulled together a meeting in our executive conference room and had representatives from the Oregon Department of Justice, the FBI, the U.S. Department of Justice, and all the brass from my organization. After we went around the room and engaged in introductions, just as we were about to sit down, one of my federal colleagues looked at me and said, "How do you manage as the only woman in this group of men?" My first thought was, I hadn't noticed. Great, right? I grew up in a time where I didn't see male colleagues. I just saw colleagues. I didn't realize I stuck out like a sore thumb in my hot pink crushed velvet jacket and my pink rhinestone pin. That first thought I hadn't noticed was quickly pushed away by my second thought that startled me. I hadn't noticed. As someone who prides herself on being a feminist and pushing for equality and advancement for all, where were the women and what was I doing to help advance their careers and get them in that conference room? So while I believe it's every leader's responsibility to hire the best and the brightest and to create the most diverse workforce, I believe as the first female director of the Oregon Department of Corrections, that bar should be raised for me. So I'm working very hard to ensure that we're recruiting, training, and preparing succession planning for women and minorities who are in our agency. I believe that's what leaders are obligated to do, to create a learning environment and really invest in the individuals who make up their team in order to create the best, brightest, and the most diverse workforce. And while I think there are definitely people who are born leaders, I'm also a true believer that anyone can be a leader. I don't believe that leadership is reserved for just a minority of a team. I don't think leadership is a gene. They might prove that wrong down the road, but I do not believe that today. I don't believe it's something you inherit. Everyone is capable of developing the skills and abilities to make someone a good leader, but it takes determination, it takes self-awareness, and it takes hard work, and it takes others helping to lead the way for those who want to become great leaders. So in coaching others, and in any conversation I've had with individuals who want to advance their careers and move into leadership or move up those leadership ranks, I start with this. First, I believe that leadership is very different from management. There are managers who are leaders and leaders who are not managers, and both who are neither. If you are a leader, it means people believe in you and want to follow you. While you can force people to be managed by you, you can't force people to be led by you. If you're truly a leader, it means you are empowered by others to be a leader. You don't get to name yourself a leader. Only those following you can give you that title. True leadership comes from being a person of influence, by being a role model and gaining and holding the respect of others. So when you turn around and there are people behind you, then and only then will you know you're leading. Secondly, I believe that leaders do not have power, not even in high-level positions. The position does not give you power. All we have are our relationships. All we have are those relationships that get to influence. So I think we need to be really mindful of this and stay away from that idea of control and power and really focus on our ability to influence. I believe some of our greatest leaders are those who lead quietly without a desire for power. And my father was a master in this regard. And third, I believe in 4 pillars of leadership. The first is to communicate. Communicate, communicate, communicate. I try to err on the side of over-communicating rather than under-communicating. If you become an effective communicator, it will put you on the right track to becoming an effective leader. As I mentioned, the most important tool we have is our relationships. You build trust in relationships through transparency and communication. It's not always the case in government. I think more often in government, we fail to recognize that we don't have power, just influence, but we think we should have it. So we try to falsely create it by hoarding information. We hold things close to our chest. We may even allude to the fact that we have information, but we don't share it. And we think this builds power, and it doesn't. It backfires every time because the absence of communication is filled with rumors and innuendos, right? Knowledge is only power when it's shared. My second pillar of leadership is to be kind. I believe a leader must be kind. Even when you're mad as hell, be kind. Now, I'm half Dutch and half Irish, so you can imagine the struggle I am faced with. But I wake up every morning praying for that kindness. Always push people up. Always look for that learning opportunity, a coaching opportunity, not an opportunity to beat someone up or push them down in order to make yourself look good. I believe it is especially important to be kind when individuals make mistakes. I often talk about how we need to let others make mistakes. If your team is not making mistakes, they're probably not pushing hard enough. And don't be afraid to make them yourself and to share your mistakes when you're doing so. Doing so allows others to learn from your mistakes, but people will also be more apt to come to you after they've made one. Let yourself be a little bit vulnerable. I've talked about this briefly, but my third pillar of leadership is relationships. Work hard to build solid, long-lasting, lifelong relationships. One way to do this is to really be a trustworthy individual, which means no surprises ever. It doesn't matter if you're talking to your peers, your employees, or your supervisors. Share information with them. Let them know what's going on. Let them know what their future holds. Another way is to pay more attention to the characteristics and the personalities of others than to their job status or title. We are in this together. Now that's a mantra that I really try to push at the Oregon Department of Corrections, but you have to remember it's a paramilitary organization, right? So the stripes on the shoulders and the bars on the collars make it more difficult for people to understand the importance of that. But we push that message every day. We talk about the ability to go around the ranks in order to get something done and to do the right thing. And my fourth pillar of leadership is to focus on the individual. While keeping your eye on that big picture, don't forget the individuals when you're making your decision. I'm a true believer that if you're making broad policy decisions that are good for the agency and best for that individual sitting in front of you, then you've made the right decision. As I mentioned earlier, please remember, inequality is not left to the history books. The best way to honor the leaders who blazed those trails before us and broke those glass ceilings is to continue to work together, to support one another, and to fight for our collective cause. It really is my sincere belief that we are all in this together and we have to support one another, men and women alike. And we all need support because juggling work, education, family, kids, and everything else is not easy. I have to say that I'm incredibly fortunate to have a strong support system. My dear husband decided to be a stay-at-home dad to take care of our girls at the time of my first appointment by the governor to the Oregon Youth Authority. I recognize that not all women have this option, so I feel very fortunate in this way. But I also know, as my equal partner, if we hadn't made that choice, we would have restructured our life to make it work for both of us. And I think that is so important. We would have figured out a way to have our all. We would have figured it out together. So the question of, can women have it all, is one that's been asked over the decades, right? It's been debated for years. I believe women and men can have it all. I just believe that we individually get to define what all is. We have previous generations to thank for this. The generations that preceded us worked tirelessly, not tipping their hat to their families in the workplace, proving that they could do everything a man can do. Women, we've proven ourselves. We can fly into outer space, play professional sports, run for president, manage Fortune 500 companies, and be CEOs of our correction systems. Because of that work, you all get to define what having all means. I believe our focus now really needs to be on flexibility and understanding, so that if all means an equal focus on family, we need to value that and make space for that in the workplace. If it is faith, then we need to value that and make space for that in the workplace. If it is volunteering and giving back, we need to respect that and we need to make a space for that in the workplace. And listen, I'm not going to kid you. That comes with great work. I know that I need to put far more than the traditional 40-hour a week in order to manage the internal and external issues of this agency. But I remember speaking at a women's conference after being appointed to this position, and one of the questions that was asked was, do I feel like I need to work harder than my male counterparts? And I have to tell you, that question surprised me, and maybe it's my Midwestern work ethic, but I thought I was supposed to wake up every morning and work harder than everyone. So my all includes my family. Family comes first. First I am a wife, then I am a mother, then I am a director. And my staff, hear me say that, I practice what I preach. And I've been so fortunate, for the most part, to really be surrounded by people who support that and want it for me and want it for themselves. As just a really small example, I remember attending an important strategic meeting with one of our unions that the deputy of the agency had asked me to attend with him when I was the inspector general. During the meeting, our nanny called my cell once, then twice. I knew then that something was wrong. I stepped out and learned that my daughter Gwyneth had jumped off the coffee table and was refusing to stand because it hurt so much. I returned to the meeting, walked in, and said, "We've got a rule." My deputy, who had driven me to the meeting, didn't hesitate and said, "How fast do you need me to drive?" It is different for everyone, but as I try to find balance in my life, it really has been blending my work and professional life that has come with just great satisfaction. I bring my girls to work on occasion. The inmate work crews see them stomping the halls. The inmates see my girls' pictures hanging on the walls, their art plastered all over my office. Now, that may seem normal in a normal office environment. But it's not the standard in the prison world, where we incarcerate some very serious individuals who are master manipulators and where violence happens regularly. It's a fairly accepted security practice to keep your personal life out of the hands of those in our custody. So while that blending comes with risks, I believe it shows people that all means all, and it means always. I believe it helps our staff and the adults in our custody know I am human and that I care. I also believe it helps my 3 little girls begin to understand that all can be defined by them. Our twins are identical, so the same DNA, yet they are very different. And they tell us that their career paths are going to be very different. Amelia, who has said since she was old enough to say the word doctor that she is going to be a doctor. Gwyneth, on the other hand, has been very clear that she is going to be a mom, but not one of those working moms. Granted, that will likely change so many times between now and the time they are adults, but I find joy in their understanding of their choice. I also believe because of my life in public service, they're already beginning to really understand what it means to be a public servant and the ability to influence change. They're beginning to understand what we do. One morning, while putting pigtails, or piggy braids, as Amelia calls it, into her hair before school, she asked in a moment of silence, "Mama, how are the inmates doing?" Trying not to be overly shocked hearing this from a 6-year-old, or overly proud as her mother, I said, "They're doing quite well, Amelia. Thank you for asking." Well, she dug further. "Are they getting any better, Mama?" She sounded quite invested. I replied, proud in so many ways, "Yes, Amelia, every day they are getting a little better." So family comes first, in my opinion. Or, as I said earlier, or whatever all is to you. That must come first in order to create balance. In my mind, it's the right thing to do for the individual, but if I'm letting family come first or focusing on whatever my employees' alls are, it makes a loyal, committed, and focused employee at work. So take that for what it's worth as you develop who you are going to be and what you are going to do. In closing, I hope you recognize that you are in a very special place here at St. Ben's. I often think of the great professors, students, and community members I met during my time on campus. My experience here provided a foundation and helped me to think, problem solve, and communicate effectively, all of which have really helped me manage throughout my career and to get where I am today. Remember, for those students out there, you are framing who you are and who you will be with every moment. Don't discount a piece of it. Soak in every hike, read every book, and embrace every piece of art, conversation, and friendship. The fingerprints that are being placed on you will stay with you forever, if you're lucky. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak with you today, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you. Yes. My first job in corrections was at Youth Homes of Mid-America in Johnston, Iowa. And so that's one of the close custody facilities that manage some of the state's most delinquent youth. And I did it during a summer between my junior and senior years. And this will be interesting for the students. It actually afforded me my next job, which wasn't in public safety, but was as a bartender at the Midi. Because when I needed additional monies, I walked in knowing that they had an opening, and the first question was, do you have any experience bartending? And I said, no. And he said, well, why should I hire you? And I said, I don't know, I can work in a juvenile correctional facility. And he said, well, then you're hired. Yes.
What do you think it is about education that helps decrease recidivism? Is it they're more motivated for life, or they're bored? What do you think? Or they're boredom? What do you think has such a big impact?
I really think it is just expanding their worldview. I think with every book we read, with every class we engage in, quite frankly, with every conversation, you begin looking at life through a different lens. And so I think that starts to change their thinking, right? It really feeds into the cognitive behavioral therapy that we provide in the prisons. And so it starts to begin to change who they are as individuals, but it also gives them a set of credentials that helps them leap over the hurdles that we're putting in front of them upon reentry. That inability to obtain a housing contract because you have a felony record. The inability to get a job offer because you have a felony record. One more piece of accreditation in front of them helps really push through that barrier. Yes.
Your governor has done something about the death penalty.
He has.
Do you have much to do with those prisoners then too?
I do. I do. So Governor John Kitzhaber is now in office during his third term. This is his second time around. He was governor 8 years prior, for 8 years, where in that capacity he had the responsibility of executing 2 offenders. We had an individual waive all of his rights for appeal. And I will tell you, the appeal process in the United States is a long and laborious one. I have 34 individuals on death row. I have individuals who have been on the row for 29 years and have made it through the first 3 appeals of 9. And so he recognized that the system as it is isn't effective. It isn't what people wanted it to be or passed it to be. So when this individual waived his rights for appeal, this governor actually placed a moratorium on executions during his time in office, hoping that that would stimulate a discussion with the legislature. It's going to require a referral to the voters in order to undo that part of the Constitution. But he has been very clear that he does not want to execute an individual under our care and custody during his tenure. That being said, the courts may have a different opinion of that. Because this individual has waived his rights to appeal, there's this little gray area in the law that says the governor might not have the right to not execute him. And so that's before the courts right now. It would be my responsibility as the director of the Department of Corrections to actually oversee that execution. And so while I might have an opinion on the death penalty, and as I look at my family, they know I have an opinion on almost everything, my opinion of that really is moot, because it will be my responsibility in this role to carry out the letter of the law in the most dignified way possible. Thank you. Yes?
Related to that question, you described a system of correction that seems to be more unique. I'm wondering if it is unique, or Oregon is leading the state on reevaluating how they treat offenders. And what is your relationship with the legislature? Are you bringing them along, or is there discussions in the legislature about these changes?
Great question. I will definitely say we're not alone. I think we're standing in a state that's considered very progressive in and of itself here in Minnesota. So you should be very proud of that. But I think we are certainly amongst the few still. I think the pendulum is still on the corrections side of things. It hasn't made its way across the nation on the rehabilitative side, but it's certainly making its way. I think Congress has really pushed us in that direction with the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and other progressive changes at the congressional level. At the state level, with the state legislature, we are engaged very closely. I envision the relationship that we have as agency directors with the state legislature much of one as it would be a private organization with the oversight of a board, but a board that has the checkbook. So while the governor helps set policy for the state and even creates a governor's balanced budget, it's the legislature that actually determines what level of funding we'll receive and how I should spend it. So it has been, I would say, probably 2 decades of making this change in Oregon, and the legislature is there because we've been able to talk about this on both sides of the aisle, both the Republican side and the Democratic side, because it's about that sort of reformation makes safer prisons, and now we can prove it also creates better public safety. And having outcome measures like the lowest recidivism rate in the country at 26.5% helps us a lot in those conversations. Thank you. Yes?
At the beginning of your speech, you mentioned that the incarceration rate for women is increasing. Can you expand more on that and how you investigate that?
Yes. So we have an incarceration rate for women that's more than doubled what the incarceration growth has been for the male population. I believe that we can contribute this almost solely to the meth epidemic. We didn't see it coming across the country. Even in Oregon, we built a women's prison that was supposed to last us until 2024. It's already at capacity. And so what we've seen is that women are being convicted of drug offenses, but also property crimes in order to support their meth habits. And they're doing it at a level that's pretty serious, and that ends them that sentence in the prison system. So while there are other factors, I'd say undoubtedly that's the primary driver. Yes?
I appreciate everything you do in the leadership style. It seems very collaborative, and I'm wondering, a lot of your language and your actions seem very restorative, and I'm wondering if restorative justice has influence on what you do in Oregon or what you can do in corrections.
Great, thank you. So I think it is all about restorative justice. And when I worked in Colorado with the Colorado legislature, there was a lot of talk around restorative justice and a strong movement and a strong push in Colorado to kind of change the dynamics and engage in restorative justice. So when I got to Oregon and I was inside this progressive system that was talking about children of incarcerated parents and Girl Scouts beyond bars and really engaging, but nobody was using the word restorative justice, and I couldn't figure it out. In fact, people were referring to it as a swear word in criminal justice. Don't use the R word. And so when I poked around and asked why, we had a really progressive restorative justice program get rolled out in Oregon, and it went badly. There were victims that were exposed in a way that wasn't healthy and wasn't okay with the victim community, and the rubber band really snapped. And so while we're not using the words restorative justice in Oregon, really the philosophy both in corrections and community corrections one is one that's based in restorative justice. Yeah, yeah. Good catch, thank you. Last chance. Madam President?
Maybe I'll ask the last question if there are no other students or anyone in the audience who has a question. I don't want to take the last question if there was someone waiting. Colette, I don't want to compare running a college with running a prison system because they are very different. Although it's
I would hope.
a lot of the community has their own ideas about how we should do it.
No doubt.
But I really identified with your 4 pillars of leadership, and I don't know that I would articulate them exactly in the same way, but I can certainly say that I aspire to that kind of leadership. One of the things that intrigued me most about what you said was an interesting juxtaposition, because you talked about a paramilitary organization, but then you also talked about modeling behavior that suggested that your staff operates on a level where they are parallel to the inmates, so that they respect each other as human beings,
Yes.
as opposed to a kind of hierarchy that you would expect in a military organization. Can you talk about that juxtaposition, and particularly whether your leadership style had an impact on changing or developing that, or was it already that way?
Great. Very complex. You're just honing in on actually 2 areas that I'm most appreciative of in the work that we do. So I'll start with one. We ask so much of our staff. I think in many ways it would be so much easier if we were an organization that had guards, and we don't have guards. We don't have individuals in the corner with weapons, looking at the offenders, making the offenders walk nose down, not making eye contact with staff. In many ways, I think on its face, that would feel like a more controlled, safe environment. When I talk to individuals who have worked in the prison system for 3 decades, they tell me that's not the case. By engaging in those relationships with those offenders, they know exactly when something's out of whack. They know when something's bubbling up over here, not sitting right over here, or when there might be some gang fraction happening in our prisons. They have the pulse more so with that. But with that, I'm asking our staff to walk up to that line and then not cross over. So they have to engage in those professional relationships day in and day out. And sometimes that doesn't happen. And that's one of the reasons that Congress passed the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And so when we ask so much of our staff to walk up at that line, engage in that interaction with staff, with the inmates, but not cross over that professional boundary, it's asking a lot. So we really try to put as many supports in as possible, helping them to really feel free to engage in that professional dynamic while maintaining that paramilitary structure. Because if I have a hostage situation tomorrow, I don't need people's opinions, right? I need it to roll out in a very military-like way, and I need to know who the commander is and who's moving next and who's moving next. So that balance is even more complex. But at the same time, we really work to try to empower our staff to make the right choice. And yet we're a paramilitary organization. So I have policies, I have procedures, and I have desk manuals, right? And they're supposed to know them all, manage to them, and yet feel empowered to make the right decision. So I'll share a story, but first answer the question about did it start with me, and it didn't. I had the fortune of following 2 previous directors who had our business strategy in mind, which is the Oregon Accountability Model, which talks about role modeling, redirecting, and respecting. And so I've just been able to build on that to some degree. So we've seen change. So I remember when I was the Inspector General, walking out of the Oregon State Penitentiary, and this elderly woman was just weeping on the steps. And so I walked up to her, introduced myself, asked her if she was okay, and she explained to me that she had just driven 12 hours from California to visit her grandson in prison. and her driver's license was expired by a week, but it was expired. And so my policy says she doesn't get to go in. So that officer said, I'm sorry, you don't get to go in. I said, why don't you come on in? We're going to make an exception to that. And we really use that in our training and conversations as an example to talk about being empowered to do the right thing. And if you make a choice that's outside of that policy, but you can articulate why you did it and you think you did it for the right reason, we will support you. Fast forward to this year. Now I'm the director of the agency, and I'm leaving the state penitentiary and hustling out to whatever meeting I had before me. And a family stopped me, and they wanted to see the superintendent of that prison. And I said, well, I'm happy to get him for you, but I'm the director. Is there anything I can do for you? And they said, well, we have a compliment for you. And I said, let me hear it. We have just driven hours and hours and hours for a family visit. We brought our disabled father, who hasn't driven for years. He doesn't even have a valid photo ID. And that corporal over there, although it is in violation of your policy, let us come in for the visit. And so while it takes years to make that kind of culture change, we're seeing it happen. And I think people are proud of it, and people really are beginning to feel empowered to make the right choice, which at the end of the day helps them feel more connected to our mission. So, great. Thank you, everyone.